You're live on Newsfeed, the AM edition. I'm Ayanda Nyati. Always great starting the day with you. Speaking of which, we always start off by giving you a sense of what to expect in terms of the big stories of the day ahead as well as for the week ahead. And of course, joining us for that exact purpose is our news editor, Zain Semaar. Up close and personal we are today, which we're enjoying the new arrangement. And as we always do, Zain, of course, we'll start with trying to understand what the big stories are on NewzroomAfrika's diary first.
Yes. So on NewzroomAfrika's diary this morning, Ayanda, we continue to bring you the coverage of state capture. Quite important testimony coming out there as the Commission is drilling down into the shenanigans and the alleged corruption and malfeasance at SAA Technical. Specifically, last week you'll remember a lot of evidence coming out and testimony given about how irregular practices, contracts were awarded and so on. So today, JM Aviation Director Vuyisile Nzeko is on the stand. We also continue to bring you, obviously, the details of the Neil Agate inquest.
Yes.
Today, we expect Paul Erasmus, who's a former security branch special member, to testify about the methodologies and the techniques used by the special branch. So remember, the special branch was this security police unit that was situated in intelligence under apartheid, and he's expected to give kind of like the techniques and methodologies they used to interrogate political detainees.
That should be incredibly interesting because, of course, this will, again, get us hopefully a step closer to establishing the likelihood behind some of the methods used.
You remember that the pathologist, the pathologist, Steve Naidu, last week testified that another inconsistency is coming out, that even the time of death, when it was reported, might have been incorrect. So they suspect, or the evidence that's emerging now might suggest that Neil Agate had died even way earlier than the death had been reported.
Absolutely.
Also, Sipa Kema will be going to Germiston this morning, where the unfortunate death of another 17-year-old learner who allegedly or apparently jumped out of a taxi to avoid being assaulted by passengers. Really a crazy story, but bringing into sharp focus the issue of scholar transport. Remember, in the same area, quite ironically, a 15-year-old learner was sexually assaulted and then later murdered as a result of missing a school taxi in the afternoon.
That's right. Yeah.
So again, the issue, two separate incidences where young girls are assaulted, murdered, and the common denominator is their transport to and from school.
Absolutely.
Something that we have to look at.
Absolutely, absolutely. Some of the things that we're also looking at this morning is obviously, I guess, looking back over 30 years since the release of former President Nelson Mandela from Victor Verster prison. I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you have quite clear recollections of that day. And look, a big part of knowing where we're going is also really having a grasp of where we come from. I mean, what are some of your recollections of that day as you observed it along with millions others, not only in South Africa but across the world? Okay,
so that day was pretty confusing as well as it was exhilarating. So confusing in the sense that people didn't know because this announcement that the ANC had been unbanned, the South African Communist Party, Umkhonto weSizwe, all these organizations were unbanned, and it came as quite a surprise to a lot of people on the ground, although ANC leadership at the time knew about these events coming. So I remember us rushing through as young people from Mitchell's Plain to the Grand Parade, where the President Mandela was expected to come and speak, and where he did make his first public speech after 27 years in prison. And I can remember the activists who went to go and fetch him were scrambling around for transport to pick up Nelson Mandela. And eventually they couldn't get like a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW as would have been the norm. They got a GLI 6 Toyota Cressida, old beat-up car, and then Tony Ngeni was there, Winnie Mandela was there at the what was then known as Victor Verster prison, to welcome the former president. And then I can also remember us following him from there to an activist who was then part of the Gatesville community, Salim Mauser. The former president had his first cup of tea as a free man at that activist's house.
I wonder where that cup is, amongst other things that were used. Wow. It's an exceptionally important moment for us, as I'm sure you'll be able to testify through your own recollections. Again, because whilst we deal with, the issues of the day, which we're about to do now in the newspapers, the Escoms, the SAA, State of the Nation address coming up in just a moment, there are many instances where it feels like we lose sight of what those instances meant. And how we should respond to today's issues. And it does bring us to the newspapers today. And, like I said, we spoke for choice on which issue to start with, so to speak. But I'll sort of kick us off with the business day this morning. Of course, they're reflecting on a court ruling from the High Court in Pretoria yesterday, essentially dismissing Eskom's bid to have its case against NERSA over the tariff hike increases heard on an urgent basis. And that's worth emphasizing, because I remember at first glance a whole lot of people celebrating that the case has been dismissed. It hasn't necessarily been dismissed. It's the urgency of the matter that's been dismissed. The merits of the case still need to be ventilated at a later stage, and essentially the court yesterday announced that it just doesn't believe that the bid to have it heard on an urgent basis was strong enough.
I think also important to note is that Judge Jody Collopin had actually said that it's not the court's place to decide on the regulation of electricity prices, that he's leaving it to the experts, which basically means that NERSA, with its suggested 8% increase, is the way to go. And he's quite cleverly kicked the ball back to the regulator, back to the politicians, back to the utility, and in saying, actually, the court is not the proper place to decide. We have regulatory bodies who have more expertise in this field, and it's their job to set the price of electricity.
Yeah, and that's why we're going to have an expert on the show coming up this morning as well to help us understand exactly that issue, right? Now that the court has essentially said that this is not within their purview, what kind of possibilities exist not only for Eskom but for NERSA, and what kind of possibilities exist for you and I as South Africans, of course, as we kind of watch with bated breath to see whether the prospects of us essentially paying double for electricity would materialize. Very quickly also on the business day this morning, we have the Zuma trial coming back into sharp focus. Our political editorial contributor, that is, Karen Morn, sort of penning a story about Zuma having more claims about how the NPA is essentially treating the case reminiscent in the ways of the apartheid prosecutors. And I don't know, I guess in many instances some people may have kind of expected him crying foul in this kind of way. And so I imagine many South Africans will be responding either by yawning or by trying to obviously hear what he has to say over this issue. He's essentially, claiming that the ways in which the trial has proceeded is quite close to apartheid-era abuses against him. And this comes obviously months after he had also withdrew similar claims that he made against Billy Dawa, right? And, Billy Dawa went on to then sue Zuma, alleging, among other things, that he was a liar driven by hatred. So we'll kind of see what kind of pushback these kind of latest claims will have for the former president. You're looking at the Citizen.
I'm looking at the Citizen, and it starts off by saying, sorry, state of Cyril's nation. And I think the president is increasingly coming under pressure to deliver a State of the Nation address that includes some kind of what people would perceive as political imagination and political will to take the hard decisions. So lots of focus in the newspapers on the upcoming State of the Nation address. I want to just quickly read about an anti-Gordon campaigner flop. So a survey was done by the South African Citizen Surveys, which basically suggests that ahead of the State of the Nation address, it measures the popularity of politicians. And funny enough, the top 3 politicians are all ANC politicians. So it's Cyril Ramaphosa at 62%, the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, then Pravin Gordhan, followed by one of his main detractors, the EFF leader, Julius Malema, and then with 15% national support, John Steenhuisen, one of the contenders for the DA leadership race. He's significantly lower than the previous leader, Mmusi Maimane, who, when he entered the fray as, or the political fray as opposition leader, came in at 24%. So we're not sure yet about the methodology and the sample size of the survey. It was just an important, I think, measurement to look ahead about politicians' popularity.
Right, and I wonder how that's likely to change after the President's State of the Nation address on Thursday. I imagine it's almost impossible to please everyone.
two other stories that I think we keep on mentioning on this show, and it's worthwhile looking ahead, is basically another story that talks about South Africa, a collapsing state. It talks about the financial the stress that municipalities are in, doubling from 64 to 125. Now, we'll also know that there are a series of events across the country involving local communities and local councils. Makanda is an example of that, where I think there's going to be an escalation of conflict between local city councils and residents.
Absolutely. Let's shift focus to the Sowetan if we can. They're leading with a follow-up from yesterday's story. We thought car was being stripped is the headline they're going with today. Yesterday, we had heard a recollection essentially of a couple that had reported the car being in a foreign area. You know, the story essentially very quickly is the wife is at home. She sees the car through their tracker device entering an area that she doesn't know of. It turns out the husband went there to a party, didn't say though. And of course, this causes friction between the couple when the husband comes back home. However, as that argument ensues and continues, the tracker company, which wasn't updated that the car has now been found, comes to their home to see the car outside being washed by their 20-year-old son. They think he's the guy who stole the car, and essentially the allegation is that they respond quite aggressively and kind of inflict wounds to him that I understand were quite life-threatening, and he's currently in hospital still trying to recover from those wounds. So once again, today they're responding, taking that story forward for us. They're mentioning how the company thought that this gentleman, who's a 20-year-old son, was actually trying to strip the car. But still, I think there are still many questions. I mean, if you are a car tracking company and you approach a vehicle in a place, hopefully you're able to check the address at the very least to see whether the car is actually sort of matched with the address that has been registered under. Had that been done, I think they would have realized that the owners live here, and so there's a bit more to this than what we thought. Needless to say, of course, that in spite of the back and forth, this poor young man is now obviously trying to stay alive for what I think was a completely avoidable situation.
On the Star this morning, Ayanda, great picture of the former President Nelson Mandela and his wife, or his then wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. And also, Africa on high alert for corona outbreak. Now, our senior political reporter, Ziyanda Ngobo, will also today be looking at allegations that Pretoria had been slack in dealing with South Africans in China and trying to get them back to South Africa when the outbreak happened in China. So the death toll of this outbreak now reaching over 1,000, quite worrying. Africa, they say, has not reported any big cases, but we remain on high alert. And then a story also, devastating blow for Eskom, which we've talked about.
That's right. So we'll keep an eye on all these stories and a whole lot more right here on the Newsfeed edition of, the AM edition of Newsfeed, that is.